I didn't intend to start this way, but I just want to say that I woke up this morning feeling ashamed to be an American. I think it's really tragic what's happened, and it's going to impact a lot of the whole world in really difficult ways. That said, I think the Trump administration will be supportive of psychedelic research, and that will still move forward. What I'm going to speak to you today about is globalizing access to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. I started MAPS in 1986. I have two sort of tracks for my education. One was learning to be a psychedelic therapist, and then the other was learning about therapy for culture, and went to the Kennedy School of Government, where I have my master's and PhD, with my dissertation on the medical regulation of the medical use of psychedelics. And 28 years after I started MAPS in '86, in 2014, we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which is a for-profit pharmaceutical company that was originally intended to be 100% owned by the nonprofit, so that we would have nonprofit ownership of a public benefit pharmaceutical company, and that would bring forth MDMA out into the world. And then I'm speaking to you not as a representative of Lykos, the pharmaceutical company, but as the president and founder of MAPS, the nonprofit. We started 38 years ago, as I said. It turned out that our anniversary, April 8th, was the full solar eclipse through the United States, so we felt the universe was celebrating our anniversary as well. And this is a picture from the solar eclipse on that day. We've raised about $150 million in donations over the course of the history of MAPS. And we've had enormous amount of volunteer support and people working under market, people who are really mission-driven. And what MAPS is doing now, the nonprofit, is working towards the globalization of access and also towards legalization. So I feel on the one hand that we're trying to make psychedelics, particularly MDMA and other psychedelics, available through FDA with insurance coverage under direct support of therapists. And at the same time, we're trying to make a post-prohibition world so that the psychedelics are available to people without having to go through the medical system, without having to have a diagnosis. In addition, today there was a ballot initiative in Massachusetts, where I live, to legalize plant medicines, similar to what happened in Colorado several years ago, and the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, but that initiative in Massachusetts failed to pass. And what that means, I think, is that we need to do more public education and to do more work through the FDA. So the FDA path is really essential. So Lykos was something that I had hoped this pharmaceutical company, as I said, would be funded by donations. But then we were the victims of our own success, in a way, and we created an entire ecosystem, and there are hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies, and it became more difficult for us to find donors when they saw all sorts of people investing. So we've got about $160 million in investments, and that has shifted the balance a bit between public benefit and return to shareholders. MAPS, the nonprofit, is the single largest shareholder of the for-profit, and we appoint the majority of the board. Similar to the OpenAI situation, though, I think that the interests of the investors are now going to change things even more. But the nonprofit has three basic missions. One is advancing research, the other is changing policy, and the other is shaping culture. We just won a major victory with the FDA on a marijuana project. We have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study cannabis in 320 veterans with PTSD. Cannabis is palliative, it's not curative. You need it every day. It's more like an SSRI, something like that. But for several years, the FDA has been blocking us from studying smoked marijuana, blocking us from studying vaporized marijuana, blocking us from patient self-titration, meaning where patients adjust their dose. And so we've worked with lawyer scientists, and just a couple weeks ago, we completely won. So that's, in a sense, what we mean by advancing research. And not only will that help us go forward with this project, but it will help the entire field of cannabis researchers in America. Now everyone can study smoked and vaporized cannabis. changing policy, one of the things that we work on, for example, is the U.S. Sentencing Commission that sets the penalties for distribution, sales of different drugs. And right now, if you're arrested with a pile of MDMA in one hand and a pile of cocaine in another, you actually go to jail more for the pile of MDMA. It was made, these penalties, at a time of hysteria over MDMA neurotoxicity. So that's one of the things by changing policy that we work on. And then shaping culture is through our public education efforts and through conferences and various work. Now, this is the MAPS logo as interpreted by the psychedelic artist Alex Gray. And the essence of this logo, what we're trying to communicate, is that the hands are the prominent feature and the psychedelic is the background. And what that means is that it's about humans helping humans. It's about the therapy. It's not primarily about the drug. You can take psychedelic drugs and you can end up worse off, you could end up better off. But when we work with severe PTSD and other clinical conditions, it's really about the therapy. And I think one of the things that's concerning to me about the drift of the whole psychedelic industry now is that they're getting this message, FDA doesn't regulate psychotherapy, it's problematic, and so the field is sort of moving in the direction of minimizing therapy and just focusing on the drug, and that's not what's best for patient outcomes. We will be having the world's largest conference on psychedelics, to which you're all invited to in June in Denver. We had 2 years ago, in also June in 2023, we had 12,400 people come to the conference. And we have bipartisan support. So we had the governor of Colorado, a Democrat, Jared Polis, open the conference, and then we had the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, who was on Trump's cabinet before, Secretary of Energy. And he's heard so many stories about Navy SEALs and others that have not gotten the help they need for their trauma from the Veterans Administration, have gone down to Mexico for Ibogaine. So we've been able to take psychedelics out of the culture wars and have built this remarkable situation of bipartisan support. So I'll give you a very brief history of MDMA. This beautiful picture of the molecule. It was invented in 1912 by Merck, and they had no idea what it was. They were looking at manufacturing, getting around a competitor's patent, and so they had a different synthetic pathway. MDMA happened to be one of the steps on the way, and they patented it. They didn't even do anything with it for 15 years, and then they gave it to animals and found nothing of interest and abandoned it. So MDMA is in the public domain. It was rediscovered in the 1970s by Sasha Shulgin. Sasha had developed a biodegradable insecticide for Dow in the 60s, and they'd given him his own laboratory to do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted to do was psychedelics. And he'd been very much influenced by a mescaline experience that he had. And so after a while, it sort of became uncomfortable for him to continue to do this work inside Dow on psychedelics. He left and he set up his lab at home and he taught classes. And there was a drug called MDA that was popular in the 1960s. It was criminalized in 1970. And so Sasha was looking at how do you modify the chemical so that it would be legal and also be valuable for therapy. And so he sort of stumbled on MDMA, intentionally stumbled on it, and felt that it had incredible therapeutic potential. And what he then did is he gave it to Leo Zeff, who we called the secret chief. He was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. And he was at his place where he was going to retire, and he decided that instead of retiring, he would end up really bringing forth MDMA, which he thought had tremendous potential also. He taught a lot of therapists and psychiatrists, and there were about 500,000 doses of MDMA that were used in these underground quiet settings, even though it was illegal. But it sort of escaped out of these settings and became marketed as ecstasy in public settings. And that's what eventually caused it to be criminalized. It sort of became a party drug, particularly in Dallas and elsewhere. And then in 1984, the DEA moved to criminalize. So when I learned about MDMA, it was 1982, and it was clear that it was both this therapy drug but also a party drug. But the government didn't really know that it was a therapy drug. They just knew about it in the above-ground party drug settings. So we were able to prepare to introduce various people to MDMA who would try it when it was legal, and then they would be willing to potentially testify in the case that we knew was coming. So in that picture, you can see me taking a picture. That's where I was sort of spying on the DEA. Once they moved to criminalize it, they had 30 days in public comment period. And on day 30, I walked into their office and asked for a hearing. And we managed to get it. We had pro bono support from major lawyers in D.C., and we were winning in the courts, and we were winning in the court of public opinion. We had Roman Catholic monks talking about how MDMA helped them enhance their meditation in the monastery. We had rabbis talking about MDMA like the Sabbath. We had professors of Harvard Medical School psychiatry talking about the value to therapy. And so the DEA, in a desperate move, realized that they were losing. They emergency scheduled MDMA on the grounds that it was terribly neurotoxic, that one dose, permanent brain damage, major functional consequences. And the irony here is that the first move to criminalize MDMA was itself illegal. The DEA did not have the authority to emergency schedule. Congress had given that authority to the Attorney General, but they had never subdelegated it down to the DEA. But nevertheless, it was criminalized. It wasn't clear for about a year later when people who had been arrested, their lawyers showed that they didn't have the authority to do it. So in 1986, this was me, I started MAPS, and it was clear that the only way forward was going to be through the FDA. Through science, through medicine, through where people were suffering, that was the opening point into the culture. And I felt that MDMA was the most gentle of all the psychedelics. It's very profound, but it's very gentle. And it can really help people process fear-based emotions. And we needed a patient population that would help us get bipartisan support, but also where it was severe, what they suffered from, that it could lead to suicide, that it would cost a lot of money for insurance companies with untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's how MDMA and PTSD came together as kind of a strategic decision. And it took us 30 years, from 1986 to 2016, for us to, the first 6 years, all of our protocols were rejected by FDA. Starting in 1992, they opened the door to psychedelic research for the first time in multiple decades. It took us through the 90s to do the phase 1 dose-response safety studies. Again, we're doing things in sequence, not in parallel, because of the challenge of doing the fundraising. And then we did 16 years from 2000 to 2016. The first study ever for MDMA for PTSD took place in Madrid. And we had that going, and it was going pretty well. It was women survivors of sexual assault. And when it was a dose-response study, when it was still in the early stages, there was an article in La Paz, there was TV shows about it, and that alerted the Madrid Anti-Drug Authority, and they shut the study down for political reasons. So that was heartbreaking. Then it was clear that we had to really focus on the U.S. and make progress with the FDA, and that would make it easier for us to do work around the world. So at this meeting on November 29th, we presented the data to the FDA and said, we think we're ready to go to phase 3, the stage where you do the large-scale placebo-controlled double-blind studies in order to prove safety and efficacy to get to prescription use. And FDA said yes. But I knew that there was a lot of challenges. How do you do a placebo-controlled study with drugs that are so active that you know you've taken them? So we engaged in an 8-month process called the Special Protocol Assessment, and we negotiated every aspect of the phase 3 design with the FDA, and at the end of it, we got what's called an agreement letter. They had approved what we were doing and said that we would like you to do therapy with inactive placebo with therapy with full-dose MDMA. And the reason that we settled on that is because I had spent these 16 years doing the phase 2 studies looking for what I thought would be the way to do the double-blind, would be therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full dose. And the challenge is to find the low dose that's high enough to cause confusion, but not so high that it's so therapeutic you'd never tell the difference between the two groups. And what we discovered, to our surprise, is that the low doses, 25, 30, 40, 50 milligrams, actually made people uncomfortable. It's like they're activated, but there wasn't enough of the fear reduction, and then you're having them talk about the most painful things that have ever happened in their lives. And so it compromised the therapy. People still got better, but if they had gotten therapy with no MDMA at all, they did even better. So that's why it didn't seem that the low-dose MDMA was going to be a good choice as an active placebo. And then we discovered also, to our surprise, that the 75 milligram dose group was lower than we thought, but it was very effective. We did a study in veterans, firefighters, and police officers. One group got 30 milligrams, one got 75, one got 125, and the 75 milligram dose group did the best. Because of randomization, the 125 group had more depression than the 75 group, but nevertheless, the 75 milligram dose group did great. So there was no sweet spot that we could find where there was an active placebo that was not either compromising the therapy or tipped over to being enhancing the therapy. And that's why the FDA said to us, do therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full-dose MDMA, which later became a problem, as I'll explain, with the advisory committee. So then we went to Europe, to the European Medicines Agency, and we negotiated with EMA, and they said that they would accept the studies that the FDA would want us to do, and we'd have to do just one more study in Europe in order to get approval through the EMA. And they requested specifically that we enroll refugees and migrants. So these are just the results from our 2 phase 3 studies. And this is our treatment. It's designed to say, what is the best that we can do for patients? How do we maximize therapeutic outcomes? And that meant we did 42 hours of therapy. There's 3 MDMA sessions, each 8 hours long, with 2 people there. One is a licensed therapist, the other is an apprentice or could be another licensed therapist. And there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, the 3 before the first MDMA session for preparation, and then 3 after each MDMA session for integration. So again, you can see how what we're designing is really about psychotherapy that's enhanced by the MDMA. And the first session that we did, people would get 80 milligrams, and then what we do is after 2 hours, we give half the initial dose in order to prolong this experience, because people are at this what's called the optimal zone of arousal. It's really useful for them. They've suffered for a long time, so we extend the period of time that they're in this therapy. And there's a recent researcher, Doblin, a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins and UC Berkeley now, that has talked about how psychedelics promote neuroplasticity and create what she calls a critical period. And it turns out that the longer you are in the psychedelic session, the longer this neuroplastic critical period lasts. And so I think that sort of validated our choice of extending this period of time. So this is, and then the final outcome measure was at 2 months after the last MDMA session or experimental session. And what we wanted that to do is to demonstrate that the results are durable, because if this is not durable, it's labor intensive, it's expensive, and it might not be covered by insurance. So that was the 2-month follow-up. And then there's 1 year and longer follow-ups that we've done as well. So we published both of our studies in Nature Medicine. This first one showed that those people that were in the therapy without MDMA, 32% no longer had PTSD at this 2-month follow-up, which itself is pretty tremendous. These are severe PTSD patients. They've often tried other medications and other psychotherapies, and they've not helped or not helped enough. And yet the therapy itself without MDMA, a third of them no longer had PTSD. But when you add MDMA, it more than doubles to be 67%. So that really was highly statistically significant, 0.0001, 1 in 10,000 chance that the difference was due to something other than the MDMA. Science, at the end of the year, 2021, has a list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the world, and they pointed to our study as one of them. The winner was protein folding, AI for protein folding. So the second phase 3 study, we moved down to moderate to severe PTSD because we wanted it not to be limited just to severe PTSD. And what we showed here was that the therapy by itself, 47.6%, no longer had PTSD. And I think the way in which this therapy is constructed, with 8-hour sessions, with music, with headphones, with people going in, able to talk about whatever they want in this sort of inner-directed therapy method that we have manualized, it's up on the MAPS website, it's remarkable. This is better than all the other therapies that have been tested for PTSD in terms of the therapy alone, how well the results were, and we have a very low dropout rate. The other therapies, the VA just did a study with 916 veterans. It took them 6 years. They published it about 2 years ago, and they compared cognitive processing therapy with prolonged exposure, and they had 50% of the people dropped out of the study. The therapies so confront you with your trauma that people are re-traumatized. And so we had very, very low dropout rates because we don't force people to talk about their trauma. They can come at it whenever they want to. So when you add MDMA, again, it's 71.2% no longer have PTSD. And another, at this point, was another 16% had what's called clinically significant reduction of PTSD symptoms, meaning they still had PTSD, but their lives were measurably changed for the better because their symptoms were reduced. And some of these people over time would continue to get better. They learned how to process their trauma. So these were our remarkable results. That was also 0.0004. So, 1 in 2,500 chance that it was random. So on December 11th, 2023, Lykos, the pharmaceutical company, presented all this information to the FDA. Disastrously, on June 4th, the advisory committee met, and they had not been properly educated by the pharma company about the therapeutic method, about how we arrived, the history of how we arrived at the double blind, and the advisory committee rejected the application. Recommended against it, and then August 9th, the FDA rejected the application. And so that was just really heartbreaking, but I think it was this series of misunderstandings and accusations, and the pharma company said, let's just do what they called a quiet period, which is traditional in pharma, but when you have a drug that people know about, and when you have critics, you really need to respond. So basically, the pharma company lost control of the narrative, lost control of public education, and the advisory committee people responded more to the media critiques than to the scientific briefing package. So now there's ongoing negotiations between FDA and Lykos, and they had a meeting on October 10th, and there is a path forward. It'll probably take about 3 years. It will involve one more new phase 3 study, and so this is it's not a rejection. It's a rejection of approval now, but there is going to be this path forward. Now, the Dutch, we were doing research in Europe as well, as I mentioned. Lykos in early 2023 shut down the research in Europe for financial reasons, and so the Dutch government said, we've seen it be really helpful to our patients. Eric Vermetten, who is the principal investigator of our site in the Netherlands, was the chief psychiatrist for the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and he had seen people getting better that he had not seen in other ways. So the Dutch set up this state committee on MDMA as their equivalent of the FDA advisory committee, except for it had real subject matter experts. They had a year to review the data that the FDA advisory committee had about 3 weeks, and they had to justify their findings by a book report about why they came to the conclusions that they did. So they presented their result. Their results were basically that efficacy was proven, safety was proven, and because there was no company trying to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe, they recommended large-scale naturalist studies, more like compassionate use, but with data gathering. And on October 3rd, the Dutch Parliament Committee on Mental Health met and accepted the recommendations. So that's what we hope will be spread throughout Europe, is this idea of these sort of naturalistic studies where it's more like, from this report, they said, scientific literature uses the term real-world data collection, as this type of research allows for providing a personalized type of therapy, as would be the case in the normal course of events. So the goal is to treat a bunch of people, gather the data together, and see if EMA will be willing to accept this as a equivalent to a phase 3 study. And so a new nonprofit has been started in Europe to try to develop MDMA in Europe in a nonprofit context that would be more for public benefit. Now, this is the picture of the psychedelic therapy clinic of the future. And while I've talked to you just about MDMA, what we're really about is bringing the entire ecosystem forward and trying to get all the different psychedelics approved. And so what ideally would happen is that the therapists would be cross-trained in all the different psychedelics. So this is, for example, ketamine, ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin, MDMA, and then they would develop a customized, personalized treatment for each individual patient. And so I think that there won't be an MDMA clinic here. Right now there's ketamine clinics in a lot of different places, but as these other psychedelics come online through regulatory agencies, this is what psychedelic therapy of the future will look like. Now, in terms of globalization, basically what I'm saying is that the pharma company that we've created, Lykos, is going to go where the suffering is, but where the money is. And that the nonprofit is going to try to go to where the suffering is, but where there is no money. And this idea of net zero trauma by 2070, net zero does not mean no trauma, but it means that if we look at the humanity as a whole, from the very beginning my idea was global, and we've, sorry, sorry, my timer, sorry. So the idea is that we want to reach a place where there are two kinds of traumas. One is traumas that people experience during their life, and the other is multi-generational trauma passed down by epigenetic mechanisms from parents to children. And so, Bhutan has created the gross national happiness measure. So what we would like to create is a gross national trauma measure, and then we would use this over the next 45, 50 years, others as well, to sort of chart progress. Can we really reduce the amount of trauma that humans are experiencing? We think it's actually going to get worse. These are just an example of the different domains of trauma that we would need to measure in order to develop this gross national trauma measure. And there's a series of studies that we're just doing pilot studies, 4 or 5 of them over the next couple of years. And then the goal would be, once we've demonstrated that these studies can be done, even without FDA approval, we'll go for like a $100 million grant to really globalize access in this kind of humanitarian way in cultures that we're having to look at where they don't have a lot of therapists, don't have a lot of psychiatrists. We'll have to have group therapy models. We'll have to have different kinds of healers. And so one of the first projects is in Denmark, where there's a bunch of Syrian refugees that are treated by this Oasis treatment center, and they've been made into citizens, and they have PTSD. So the thought would be second-generation Syrian refugees that speak Danish, that are less religious than their parents, willing to try psychedelics, and don't think they're going to go back to Syria. So this is in the process of protocol development right now. We have other projects in Somaliland where we've sent MDMA for the training of therapists. And so that's the other part of this idea, is that when you work in cultures that don't have a history of psychedelic experiences or psychedelic culture, the therapists themselves will benefit a lot, both dealing with their own traumas, but also understanding what the drug does, so that then they can be more effective as they give it to their patients. So the Somaliland project is really the one where we shipped MDMA from Canada, and the therapists have had remarkable experiences, and now we're moving towards moving this into a new study for PTSD. We've done trainings in Sarajevo with Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there's people who have been traumatized by the civil war there. And so this would be the survivors of the Srebrenica massacre, where around 8,600 Muslim men and boys were killed. These were survivors are the women. So this now is also in the protocol development stage. We've trained the therapists. And then we're also working in Ukraine. And so we're going to be doing a training for Ukrainian therapists in March, probably the second half of March, and then potentially also work in Poland as well. So Ukraine has had terrible laws left over from Russia in that you cannot do research with Schedule I drugs unless they've been made into a medicine somewhere else. So that has blocked what we've been trying to do in Ukraine. But later in this month and in December, they're probably going to change that so that it will be possible. They have such a burden of PTSD and trauma that they're willing to change those laws so that we can do research with MDMA. And then basically what we're going to try to do is prioritize global communities with the largest burden of trauma and the fewest resources for treatment. So this will be done by the nonprofit. My hope had been that the pharmaceutical company would, as part of its public benefit mission, do these global humanitarian projects, work on group therapy. But as it turned out, the focus has been narrowed to working with FDA hopefully over time, once FDA does approve in a couple years, then the pharma company will expand, and so we're sort of planting the seeds that we hope will then spread through this pharma company. So that's the vision of how we're going to move forward to help really reduce the burden of trauma on humanity so that people are not motivated by fear and anxiety as they were in the election in America that really demonstrated how politicians can manipulate people's fears and anxieties, create outside enemies, and the hope is that if we can help people reduce their burden of trauma, they can see the world more carefully, and then they can make more rational decisions. So thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.